So today I'm going to sort of, I guess, do a combination of things, or a few different things. So I want to think about this idea of audio descriptors, but specifically think about them from the point of view of using them for some kind of musical purpose. And so I guess the first part of that is probably to think about what audio descriptors are. Then we'll spend some time thinking about what people do with them. And then I want to spend some time at the end thinking about how they might be more complicated than they seem in terms of at least musical usage. And some of that will be discursive, and I'll try and give a few kind of much more meaningful examples. And there will be some code along the way. I'm not going to focus so much on the mechanisms for how stuff is done, although we might refer to that, and we might refer to various places where you might pick up on those things. But I will show some code to do with some specific examples. So the first point is, what is an audio descriptor in the most general terms that we can think about it? So it's some kind of contextual piece of information about the content of an audio signal. That might seem vague, but I would argue that's the only kind of general description we can give, because that might come from different places and it might take different forms. So that information might be symbolic, so it might be some kind of labeling. It might be numeric, either discrete or continuous, and it might have come from a manual source, or it might have come from directly calculating something off the audio signal, which is probably the case that we're going to concentrate on. So in order for that descriptor to be effective in whatever sense we mean, it has to encode something meaningful about an audio signal. Now that doesn't necessarily, in some contexts, mean humanly meaningful, but it has to tell us something useful about what's going on with the audio signal underneath. And the idea is that we're going to end up with some kind of algorithm or some kind of usage where we have content awareness. So we're putting sounds into something, and rather than just acting in the way that we normally work in an environment like Max or SuperCollider, where we just have samples coming in and we don't really know anything about what's in them, we just put them through a process. So like a delay is not a content-aware piece of processing normally. It just delays whatever comes in. It's got no idea of what it's delaying. The sound can totally change, and it carries on behaving in the same way. But audio descriptors allow us to have some kind of content awareness. What's been put in, what's the input, and therefore, and how might we want to use it. Sometimes it's a form of machine listening. Owen isn't here or isn't here yet. If he was to turn up, he'd tell you that machines don't listen, and we could argue about that. But sometimes it's a form of trying to model some aspect of a perceptual process. And sometimes it's very much not. So I would argue that something like zero crossings, counting zero crossings, is not modelling listening. Nobody listens by counting zero crossings in a signal. Unless maybe James Alum, do you listen by counting zero crossings in a signal? Maybe you've got those kind of ears, but I can't tell you how many zero crossings are going on. So also there's some kind of level of translation between how can we do some simple maths often that tells us something that would be perceptual, and there can be a gap there that we'll come back to later. Okay, so what are these descriptors like? I've listed just some of them. Pitch is a nice obvious one. We can all start there. We can understand that. Loudness, importantly, in the descriptor world, if you come across the term loudness rather than amplitude, we are talking about some kind of perceptual measure. So I might also have other measures there, like I've got energy, which is an objective measure. Doesn't tell us about how we hear it. We might talk about the energy temporal centroid, so in a sound, particularly if we've got like a traditional instrument with a note, where is the tendency of the energy? Is it towards the beginning? Is it in the middle? That might tell us something about the attack, maybe. But that's one where we're starting to think about time. Inharmonicity, spectral flatness measure we'll see later, various measures of spectral shape, which may or may not be meaningful. The tri-stimulus is this concept that the first three harmonics or partials of a sound have some particular relevance to what's going on in the sound. That's fine, although we've already made an assumption that the sound has three harmonics in it. So we might need, in order to know whether these descriptors are going to be useful, we might need some kind of content awareness before we do our content-aware descriptor analysis, because the numbers that come out of that might be meaningless. So there's another kind of barrier there. Probably the sort of key paper that everybody references is this one, which is Peeters. It's a paper that came out of EarCam called A Large Set of Audio Features for Sound Description. And it's lots of pages long, and it has lots of nice pictures. And somewhere it has some kind of formulas for various calculations. So if we look, oh, not that one, this one. Temporal centroid, so we can see how to calculate a temporal centroid or a shape-based centroid, which we might do in a minute as a little programming exercise. It's quite terse. It's not always consistent in its use of symbols. You have to be a bit careful with it, and you can make mistakes, as I did translating a lot of these things about 10 years ago into some code. But it sort of covers a whole range of different descriptors, and it relates a little bit to the MPEG 7 specification, which actually specifies certain sets of descriptors as something meaningful. So if you're interested, I'll put these slides up on the mailing list later, and if you're interested in following that and kind of reading more detail, that's one place that you can follow for actually figuring out what some of these descriptors are. Okay, so the next thing we need to know is how do we actually calculate one of these things, assuming that we're interested in calculating rather than doing them by hand. Doing descriptors by hand, that's something we can all understand. You listen to something, you give it a number, or you label it, and there are various mechanisms. That might actually be quite important musically, and that's something that I've used in pieces where I've labeled samples without using any kind of objective analysis. But assuming we want to calculate something from the audio signal, how do we do that? Well, there is no single method of calculating an audio descriptor. There are various kinds of things that we can take as kind of general principles. So the first thing that might seem irrelevant, but is actually quite important, is that we're always representing, or almost always representing, I did think of one this morning that could represent a single sample, but we're almost always representing a slice of time. So we have a number or a set of numbers, and rather than representing a single, rather than representing moment by moment, they're taking into account some chunk of time, which might be a whole sound or a whole audio sample that we've recorded. It might be a smaller chunk of that. A lot of them rely in some way on frequency domain representation of sound, often just the amplitude spectrum of that, but that's not an absolute given. And we might need several stages of analysis to really get something useful. And I think this is one of the interesting things about this topic and about the Peeters paper, is that it kind of is more like a set of things that you could combine to find out something from a musical point of view about the signal. And there are a lot of descriptors in there, but there's also then a lot of things you might do with those descriptors as a secondary set of analysis. And so we end up with this kind of baffling, infinite array of possibilities. And figuring out which ones are meaningful, even to do very simple tasks, might be a little bit complicated. And I think is an area that is basically not that well explored, because a lot of people writing about this topic are writing from a point of view of a very different set of outcomes. And for those outcomes, it often works to throw a lot of numbers at something and not actually ever have to interpret them. So the musical part of the problem is really about the fact that at some point we're going to have some idea of what these numbers are meaning and how we might use them. So some of those descriptors we just take the whole thing, and it might even take time into account in some way. Sometimes we have a short-term window, as is common with frequency-based analysis, and we get what's called a raw descriptor, so we get a per-frame descriptor that tells us something about what's happening in this very short segment of sound, and then we somehow combine them by using some kind of statistical operation on the time series that comes out. Let's look at these kind of things represented as a few different things. So the very sort of simple view is we put some sound in, we do a calculation, we get a descriptor out. Ultimately, that's always going to be happening in some way. One version of that is what's happening in the second row, which is broken out in the third, which is we take the sound, we slice it up into bits. For each slice, we translate it into the frequency domain, do some kind of calculation, that gives us a raw descriptor. We end up with this time series here. We put that through some kind of statistical operation, and then that gives us a final value that represents the whole of the original sound in some way. And again, thinking about the interpretation from a musical viewpoint of that statistical operation is, I think, quite important. And again, something which may or may not be well thought about in terms of what does it really mean. The week before last, I got very angry about something that someone posted on Facebook, which is easy to do. And why I got angry about it was because it was typically very, very bad science reporting about a paper to do with, and the headline was that male birds could either sing really well or be attractive, but not both. And I thought, is that what the paper says? So I went and read the paper when I should have been probably planning a lecture. It took me about an hour or half an hour to do this work. And I read through it. It didn't say that at all, so that was problem number one. But the interesting thing was, as part of that, they were looking at variation of song, of bird song. And they had some nice fancy analysis and some nice statistics, which I sort of vaguely followed. And they did all the right things, and they had all their p-values, which I don't understand at all, so it looked like proper science. But actually, one of the main things they were doing in terms of the birdsong analysis was looking at the loudest frequencies and the frequency range, basically like tessitura. So to talk about whether one song is better or more complex, they weren't actually talking about what was better, but even to talk about complexity of songs is kind of meaningless. There's all sorts of questions about the sample size they're doing it on and whether that's meaningful in terms of, are you hearing, do we expect different birds of the same species to have really that similar a range? I don't know. So there are lots of ways that you can use these numbers, and you appear to be doing something kind of quite objective. And I'm not making a final comment on whether that paper is interesting or valid. I'm just saying there was a lack of kind of musical explanation of what those numbers would actually tell you. So some of them seem quite meaningful, potentially like the number of notes in a certain period of time. We can have another argument about whether birds have any concept of notes and how we would split it up into note-based events. But there was a lot of kind of skirting over of detail that for me might make the difference between that being really useful and really kind of musically meaningful and something that appears to be doing something useful, but might actually be telling us something quite basic just about, is it high or is it low? All right. So let's dig a little bit deeper into our exploration of these things, and let's think about what we might get from various different statistics. So I've not given all the possible examples, there are lots more, and there's a whole area of what's called time series analysis, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about in a moment about one of the other areas which is a little bit underdeveloped. So mean and median values, different kinds of average, so we can take a longer chunk of time from lots of slices and combine that and say, well, that's one value that kind of represents something about that whole range. Again, normal caveats apply. If we take a mean value, we might get a value that's not anywhere in the sample set. So we might have some value, we might have all high and low values and the average is in between, but that actual value doesn't exist at all. So let's say with volume, I've got only quiet or loud frames, and I get a kind of average medium volume out. Maybe not meaningful. So median's one way that we can at least know that we've got a value from the sample set, and it's 50% or less than 50% or more. Thinking about range or standard deviation suddenly tells us something quite different. So let's take the same example of volume or loudness or amplitude or any of these kind of measures of energy of some kind, perceptual or otherwise. If I look at the standard deviation or the range of that, suddenly I know something about how that's varying over time. I don't know exactly how it's varying over time, but I know at least how steady it is in some way. I could take the temporal centroid of any value, so where it tends to in terms of its energy. Again, if it's, that depends really on higher values having a particular kind of meaning. The position of peak or trough values. So again, peak energy values might tell us something about some kind of event in the sound. So then now I'm not necessarily just looking at the values, I'm looking at where they're located in time. And one of the, I guess, difficult things about descriptor analysis is that when you don't deal with single values per sound, but you have a time series, suddenly we've got loads of numbers and we don't necessarily know what to do with them. And somehow capturing the essence or the shape of that time series and being able to compare it to other shapes and so on is a difficult task. And that's, again, something that people have started looking into and started looking at, okay, well, how do I take all of the values over time that make up a representation of this sound and do something useful with that? And again, it's already a lot of values if I just take one parameter, but if I now have 70 different descriptors, we've suddenly got this massive multi-dimensional space, and just knowing what to do with that is a problem. We also have different kinds of frequency domain representation. So we've got the simple FFT, we've got stuff like Mel Cepstrom looking at spectral shape, or Bark bands, or ERBs. So we've got these kind of perceptual groupings of frequency bands, and often we can perform a descriptor analysis, or the same type of descriptor analysis on different different types of frequency domain representation of the same signal. So if I take the spectral flatness measure, I can do that on FFT bands, but I can also do it on Bark bands. I could also do some kind of, often you're taking an FFT as the first stage and then doing some other kind of decomposition into some other kind of representation. And again, knowing, well, why would one of those be more useful to me in one scenario than another is another complex problem. So you can see that we're getting into a situation where things are multiplying up. All right, let's see some descriptors. I feel like that's quite a lot of talking. It would be nice to see some descriptors doing something. So let's just look at some basic piece of code, and maybe I'll build it from scratch as well. I'll start from some kind of code, and we will modify from here just to save a bit of time. Actually, we'll just do this. Oh. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use an object that I made for ease, and I'm going to just request it in real time to give me frame by frame the linear centroid, linear spectral centroid. So what that's giving me is some kind of measure of the tendency of energy within the frequency spectrum. So it's a value that comes out in hertz. It is a frequency in its dimensions, and it should tell me something about what is going on with the sound that we're hearing. And we should notice also that it's amplitude invariant. So I can change the amplitude of the sound that I'm putting in. We still get the same values out. Let's make that a bit bigger. So we can see, for instance, that on the S's, where we have a lot of high frequency content, the value jumps up. In the kind of vowels where we're lower pitched, and it's a purer sound, it's lower. So if I just sort of filter some noise with my voice, we can see again quite a good correspondence between the values that we're seeing. So this is a nice, easy descriptor to understand that goes beyond the kind of typical pitch and amplitude measures that are very easy to get hold of in an application like Max or SuperCloud. And again, we could look back at the Peeters' paper and see sort of how that's actually put together. So here we're looking at the observed data x, which is the amplitude we're looking at the frequencies as being the kind of data, and we're looking actually the amplitudes at each frequency as being a indicator of the probability of observing each one. So essentially, for each frequency, the probability of observing it is the amplitude at that frequency divided by the amplitude at all frequencies, so the sum of all the frequencies. And from that we kind of calculate a barycenter, or a central tendency, and that's done by multiplying x against the probabilities. X is the frequency, so for each bin of our FFT, we multiply its frequency by the amplitude in the bin. Then at the end, we divide that by the amplitudes of all the bins summed together. And essentially what that will do is weight the frequencies, the frequency of each bin, by the amplitudes, and the higher the amplitude in each bin, the higher the frequency results, the higher the amplitude in each bin, the more likelihood that the result will tend towards the frequency that's represented by that bin. So if we imagine that we've got just one bin with energy in it, whatever that energy is gets multiplied by the frequency of that bin, and then we divide by the sum of that, which is the same energy value, and we end up with the frequency of that bin. As we start splitting energy between different bins, the weighting will give us some indication of where the central weighting or tendency of that is. So we can actually get into calculating these things by hand in a couple of different environments. So that happens in CataRT that we'll see later. That's done in FTM, and I have built in the FrameLib environment various different descriptors. So that's not the one that I want, but that will do. Let's see if we can just do that now quickly. So I've got a process where I'm going to split up the sound into chunks of audio, apply a window, do an FFT, and take the hypotenuse of the bins, which is calculating out the amplitudes. I then need to create some kind of ramp that represents the frequencies counted in bins. Let me just check. It'd be good if I could type. Can't remember what any of my defaults are. Count. The default is samples length, and the mode is requested. So that's what we want to change. So I'll make a ramp that's as long as my input. So this is going to represent my frequencies. Multiply them against the amplitudes. And I also need to sum up all the amplitudes and divide through by that. Excellent. All is well. So we have now a very simple spectral centroid measure, but you'll notice that the numbers are normalized. They're in bins actually. So I need to do some conversion on that, but we should be able to see that the number goes higher when I make a kind of S-like sound. So we have our linear centroid kind of put together by multiplying the frequencies by the amplitude in that bin, dividing through by the sum, and then we need to do some kind of scaling to get that back into the right kind of frequency values. I'm not going to do that now, just in the interest of time, but it's essentially just a multiplication. 0 hertz is in the right place. I just need to move everything else according to my sample rate and my FFT size and so on and so forth. And there are some ways we could do that. So we could start to build these descriptors right from the ground up in environments like FrameLib if we want to. But more frequently we'll come across them in something like the descriptors object or the earcam descriptors object or the Essentia library or lib extract. There are a few different options software-wise for getting these descriptors. Okay. Is it going to play from now? Is it going to go to the beginning? Good. Any questions at that point? No. Okay. So what do we do with these things? I've just shown a very simple example of how you can see it, see a simple descriptor doing something and giving us relevant values. But what are this used for? And I've sort of come up with 2 classes of use case because the majority of this research in this area is happening in a kind of music information retrieval setting or in a technical setting. And in this setting, there are some things that people are doing which we may or may not be interested in. So audio data classification is a massive industry now, particularly genre classification. Imagine if you've got the entire database of Spotify and you want to know what's hip-hop and what is experimental new music. Well, you could employ people to listen to the entirety of your catalogue, but it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time. It would be better if we could get a computer to just look at everything and say, oh, this looks like hip-hop. And so, therefore, we get quite a lot of interest in certain fields in descriptors like a tempo, which is a very high-level descriptor, quite a long way away from the audio, so assuming that we have some kind of tempo, or meter, or maybe loudness goes into that. Also, harmonic-type classifications that I'm probably not going to talk about today. Yeah?
Danceability.
Danceability, yes. That one's in Super Collider, isn't it?
Emotions.
And emotions, yes, that's my favourite. Is it happy music or is it sad music? Or neither. No, that's not, but it's either happy or sad music. I'm getting confused again with all these difficult ideas. It might be audio data mining. We've just got these massive sets of data. We want to find out stuff about what's in there. Sound matching of all kinds, telling how similar sounds are, doing recognition on specific sounds, or labelling automatically. We might start to get into some tasks that are also interesting to us as musicians. And content-aware audio processing, which I thought was going to be a really massive thing, but it's not really hit the mainstream yet. So the idea that you've got a delay, but the delay does different things according to what you put into it. There are a few papers out there, I haven't put any links, but I was reading about it a few years ago, and I haven't seen a lot come, at least into industry from that. But these are the kind of ideas that people are thinking about. Musical applications, and I guess when I say musical applications, maybe I mean kind of more creative, compositional musical applications rather than sort of more industry-based applications. But again, there's some crossover. So in terms of labeling, for instance, it might be interesting if you were working for a company like Ableton or Apple making Logic, if someone could drop in a track and it could tell them where their bass drum was and their snare drum and stuff like that. And we might be interested in that kind of thing too. So here I see sort of a real-time control and interactivity being one area, and one area that the community already knows quite a bit about. You take some numbers in, you map them to something, hey presto, you've got some kind of interactivity. But of course, it's more complicated than that if you want to make it work or interesting or clear to an audience or reliable. Again, content-aware processing. Corpus navigation, which perhaps is a larger way of thinking about this idea of navigating through stuff. So in this instance, we've got a big bank of samples, or a big bank of sounds, or fragments of sound, and we want to be able to find specific bits that have a certain characteristic. And we might want to do that offline, so we might want a kind of aid. Oh, I need a sound that's like this. Type into a computer, boom, and it gives you some things to listen to, and then you use them. Or we might want to do it in real time. So we might actually want to play back specific sounds at a certain time. And a particular branch of this, which is perhaps most well known in the kind of creative coding community, is corpus-based concatenative synthesis. And a subset of that, which we'll look at an example in a minute, is audio mosaicing. So that's specifically where you have an audio input and then you make an audio output that somehow resembles your audio input. And again, there are some interesting questions there about what the musical purpose of that is and how far that should be transformed in that process, or whether we want something that's really very close to the original. If you want something very close to the original, you could play the original, of course. So presumably we want some level of transformation. Okay, so a few sort of key techniques that come into some of this stuff. So mapping and scaling, again, hopefully most people here have some idea about, but again, issues about whether something's in a logarithmic or a linear domain can come into play in terms of making things feel like they've been mapped in a way that makes sense, or actually sometimes even just objectively making things make sense. So something like thinking about, have I got a quantity that's in frequency, which is a linear mapping of frequencies, or have I got a quantity that's given as a pitch? So if they've done their job properly, if it's called pitch, it's not true of my object, but if it's called pitch, it should be reported in semitones. And either way, it's important to know which is which, because when we then do certain operations on them, they're going to behave differently, and they're going to give us different results if we're not aware of those kinds of things. Very common technique is this idea of Euclidean matching in an n-dimensional space. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? So what happens here, we take our descriptors against some big bank of samples, and we consider each descriptor to make up a dimension in an imaginary space. And we'll see some pictures later on, particularly, maybe we'll look at a picture of CataRT to make this more meaningful, because it sounds very abstract otherwise. Let's get some screenshots. Ah, look at that. It's a two-dimensional space, and it's got some sounds in it, so each of those dots is a sound, and it's been organised by two descriptors, looks like periodicity and spectral centroid. So going in one dimension, we change how the periodicity. Going in the other dimension, we change the spectral centroid. And then we can locate a sound within that. So if I imagine being here, where there's no sound, often what I need to do is find the nearest sound. So take me from this nominal position in an arbitrary space and just find the things that are nearby. And this is a problem of matching. It doesn't have to be Euclidean matching. That's just how it's normally done. It could be any other kind of, there are various different kind of distance measures, but the most common distance measure to find in this kind of application is a Euclidean one. So one in which we consider all the dimensions to be equal, and we do some nice Pythagoras to find out what the distance between two different points is. There are some algorithms that make that fast. That's totally musically uninteresting unless your computer can't run fast enough to do what you want. It doesn't make any difference to us, the result. That's what a lot of the technical people involved are interested in. I've got 10 million data points. How do I very quickly find out which ones are nearby? It's just a technical problem. It's not to say it's not difficult, it's not useful for people to solve it, but it doesn't tell us anything about how to musically use it, necessarily. Often, the space is normalized. That has implications for what the dimensions now mean. So we move things out of their original dimensionality or their original units into these arbitrary lowest to highest. And that has certain conveniences for certain kinds of ways of working, but it also has downsides as well. It's also worth saying, as we saw on the previous picture, that these spaces are often sparse. So we have places where we have lots of points, we have other places where we don't have any points. And that's another musical problem for us to deal with, that we might imagine that now I've got this space which is nice and Cartesian and I can be anywhere on it. But that's not really the reality. What we really have is a cluster of stuff in the bottom left corner and almost nothing in the top right corner. So we have to think about what's a meaningful thing to do when someone goes up to the top right corner and says play a sound from here. Is it to play nothing, or is it to, jump quite a long distance away and do something there? And finally, something that we might see in some of the example. Oh, sorry. We can also do, I guess, a different kind of descriptor that tells us about two sounds, which is, as well as calculating distances based on these descriptors, so these n-dimensional sets, we can actually just take two sounds and compare their spectra directly and say how similar to each other are they. This is particularly applicable to audio mosaicing if you want things to really sound quite similar, depending on how you set up that spectral sort of decomposition. And so that's, I guess, a descriptor that tells us about the distance between two sounds, something we haven't looked at yet. And finally, sometimes from this n-dimensional space, sometimes we want to collapse that down onto less dimensions because, again, it's too much to deal with. And there are various techniques for doing that. I'm not going to get into the details of those. These are all dimensionality reduction techniques. I suppose what's interesting to say here is that they all take your n dimensions, put them on new dimensions, but those new dimensions are a combination of your old dimensions. So now we don't have, let's say, loudness and spectral centroid. We have sort of something that points in this direction in the original space, which is a combination of the original dimensions. So we then don't necessarily end up with even musically understandable parameters. We might be able to understand them intuitively, and that's the idea of some of the people doing this. So principal component analysis, for instance, is a way of just finding directions through that original space that put the most data, or the most change rather, on the first dimension, and then less change on the second dimension, and so on. And at some point we just discard the rest and say, that's a good enough representation of what we have. But we've lost any very direct understanding of what those dimensions mean. And again, in some applications where the way of working is to throw lots of numbers at something and give us some results, that can work well. But for a more kind of directed musical understanding, it can be a bit more problematic. Any questions there? Okay. Maybe we should actually see some people doing some stuff in various formats. So I'm going to just do, I guess, a sort of quick overview of a few of the applications that are out there. It's not exhaustive. It's just going to cover, I guess, some of the kind of key ones that people are aware of. So I've already mentioned CataRT by Demo Schwartz, which is a concatenative corpus-based synthesis piece of software. It has various incarnations. He's done lots of work with it as a performer, but also working with other performers and composers and kind of tailoring it. You can pull it apart. Who here's used CataRT or at least downloaded it? Has anyone pulled it apart and tried to make their own thing with it? Was that a...
You saw the paper?
Yeah. So lots of people have downloaded it. It is a little bit monolithic in its design. It is actually made of modules. You can, in theory, move it around. It's also been made by various people. I remember once asking Demo about some of the descriptor stuff, and he said, well, that wasn't my work, someone else did that, and they would be a better person to ask. So it's the work of a kind of team in a way, but he heads up the primary part bit. Let's just look at it doing something as a starting point for anyone who hasn't seen it do something. Or we can watch my internet buffer, which could be equally fun. Let's try that again. So there we have some kind of corpus of loaded sounds. They get arranged in the space. We can then navigate them, in this case visually, in 2 dimensions with a cursor. You could hook up different kinds of interfaces, which is part of what Demo does when he performs to this. And I suppose, even here, it's worth thinking about what is the what is the meaning of this? And the meaning of this is sounds that are somehow like one another are nearby, and sounds that are not like one another move further apart. But that also creates a question of, do we always want to navigate these kind of trains through a musical space by moving between similar sounds? Because it becomes much harder to articulate, let's say, two sets of different sounds, which if Colin was here as a percussionist, he might say something he probably does quite a lot. He has one thing that's a kick drum, one thing that's a cowbell, and they don't have anything to do with one another spectrally, and it's to do with the patterning between them. So it's already encoding some kind of musical thinking. It's not to say that you couldn't use either these technologies or CataRT to do that, but it's leading us perhaps more easily towards the idea of similar sounds being together. And what you're seeing here is how the visual representation can be based on different descriptors. So we can think about different kinds of similarity, although in both of those I think we sort of see that more pitched vowel-like sounds end up kind of in one place, and other sounds. What am I playing next? I've got no idea. Anyway, so that's an example of perhaps a key way of people in the creative coding community thinking about what descriptors might do, because it's a well-established piece of software. It's been used by a bunch of different people, and on the website you can look at people who've gone to ACAM and worked with Demo and done different things with it. So there are a bunch of pieces doing that. Pierre probably knows more about this than me. He's been investigating in the last few days, but I thought I'd include this. This is by Ben Hackbarth, who I believe is based in Liverpool, so not so far away. This is specifically corpus-based concatenative synthesis for mosaicing. So he takes in a sound and he matches sounds to that. The interesting thing, he outlines a few different things that he sees as novel about the software. One of them is that you can change the weighting of different descriptors, which I think is important, and is one way of thinking about this normalization problem. So I suppose let's put that in more concrete terms. Let's say I've got a graph, and on one side it's got pitch, or one axis it's got pitch, and on another axis it's got loudness. The thing about Euclidean matching is that we have some dimensions that are the same, and the question when I'm doing my matching in this case, so pitch versus loudness, is how many decibels is worth an octave? So how far away can I be in terms of pitch before it's the same as, so if I'm an octave away in pitch, what's that the same as in terms of decibels, or the other way around? And the way that we scale those spaces will determine whether one descriptor is preferenced over the other, so whether we're more likely to pick closer matches. And those are questions that, again, don't really have any real-world answer. We don't really have a concept of what 1 decibel is worth placed along a keyboard. So there's an area for thinking about that and thinking about the meaning of that. But we'll look at some audio examples from Ben Hackbarth's audioGuide.
It's worth saying that the strength of this is the segmentation. It's
okay.
The best sound segment.
Yeah, we have. I guess we haven't really talked about that.
Super important.
So firstly, you have to generally, if you just take in your corpus as a single sound, which is an example we'll see quite a lot, you have to break it into bits. That can also be done manually. So the segmentation is one aspect of this that you might find in this kind of software. The other novelty that he outlines is that he is, at least to some extent, looking at the morphology over time of a descriptor. So he's matching things. So if you've got a sound that changes over time, that will be part of the matching. It's not representing, let's say, the centroid by a single value. Just going to see if it might be better to have one of these mics on. White screen. Is that better?
Yeah, the other one too. Oh, yeah, that's good.
So, in the examples, we get some kind of some kind of corpus, or some extract of the corpus. The corpus is normally quite long, so a bunch of percussion samples.
Earl Brown and I spent several months splicing magnetic tape together. We sat on opposite sides of the same table. Each of us had a pattern of the splicing to be done, the measurements to be made, etc. Since we were working on tapes that were later to be synchronized, we checked our measurements every now and then.
So that's our target. We're trying to make the result, or the software is going to try and match the result to that.
Earl Brown and I spent several months splicing magnetic tape together. We sat on opposite sides of the same table.
I find that one quite hard to do just from memory.
Earl Brown and I spent several months splicing magnetic tape together. We sat on opposite sides of the same table. Each of us had a pattern of the splicing to be done, the measurements to be made, etc.
It's easier when you hear the two things together. But again, this is a question of, is the purpose of this kind of matching to give us something that's really recognizable, or is it as a way of structuring musically some sound? Because if it's just a mechanism for structuring some sound and we don't need to recognize the original, then that may or may not be important at all. So there might be some division between what we'd see as a kind of technically ideal result and a musically desirable result. Let's try another one.
I then said to David Tudor, the lecture is so soon that I don't think I'll be able to get all 90 stories written.
That one I find easier. We can remember the words sort of in relation to the text. We'll do one more, which is this idea he also has of being able to select more than one sound at a time. So not just a sort of linear edit. And this is based on piano scrapes. So that's the corpus, this kind of thing.
I then said to David Tudor, the lecture is so...
Well, we know that already. So that I find, particularly at the beginning, very convincing. So I suppose, again, as creative people, one option might be, in terms of creative use, to take a tool like this and put your sounds into it and do things with it. It's still, you still have to kind of call it in quite a complex way. Is that right, PA?
There's just a learning wall between the examples that work by themselves, and then you have the explanation of all the parameters, which is 7 pages long of very technical details, and there's nothing in between. So that's where I'm at now.
But you call it in Python, sort of almost
it's a Python call.
Command line style.
And you segment separately, then you synthesize, which is very good.
So it does break up the process to some extent. Yeah, so it's not just a black box that you throw stuff
really
into.
Customizable. And it's made by a musician in the show. The interface is negotiated through the process, which is what you're trying to say in the last half an hour, is that it's a very subjective process, and as a musician, that negotiation of what character does what according to what corpus and what descriptor is very important, and it's built in. So you can do that, but it's not like a plug-and-play thing like CataRT where you drag and drop sound and then you see that. It's very far from that.
Yeah. Aaron, did you have a question? No? Okay. Okay, a couple of quick examples of Stefano Fasciani's work. He's trying to do some slightly different things. So here we're not necessarily thinking about a corpus of samples, So he's interested in, the idea of real-time control, so we'll look at that. So real-time voice control over digital instruments. But he's also interested in mapping the timbral space of synthesizers. So in the mapping space of timbral space of synthesizers, he links up all the parameters to his software. The software then runs through as many combinations as you can be bothered to wait for it to calculate of what if I put this dial at this number. And then it creates a map, a descriptor analysis of that. Then it does some dimensionality reduction at the end, and it gives you a bunch of controls, so you can control all of the complexity of that timbral space in a much smaller space. So this is quite black boxy. There's a lot going on, but I think it's interesting work to look at. And we'll kind of jump to the sort of video examples. I'm not going to try and explain or go through the kind of tech side of things. But again, if you want to follow up on the slides.
The voice-controlled interface for digital musical instruments is a system, driven only by voice, for the real-time control of electronic musical instruments. Digital musical instruments expose many parameters to modify the generated sound characteristic, while traditional musical interfaces usually require a hand-based interaction. This implies a strong physical limitation in the number of musical parameters and events that a single player can control concurrently. The aim of this work is to exploit the voice, which is often unused by electronic musicians, to provide an additional control layer that drives a set of instrument parameters. This interface is adaptive and generic, because the mapping between voice and instrument is computed automatically from the performer voice and the instrument characteristics by machine learning algorithms. The voice is processed at subverbal level to provide minimal latency. The continuous variation of the voice timbre determines the interaction with the instrument. The target of the voice control is an arbitrary number of continuous instrument parameters that, when changed, result in a modification of the sound timbre or texture. The user provides voice varying and constant examples, and identifies the instrument parameters target of the vocal control. The learning system analyzes the relationship parameters to sound of the instrument, creating a sonic map. Then it analyzes the voice example to identify robust and independent control signals. Finally, it finds the ad hoc transformation between these that maximizes the breadth of explorable sonic space. In the runtime mapping, the timbre of the live voice input is transformed in a set of control signal, representing a spatial position. This is translated into a position in the instrument sound map, identifying a specific sound, which is associated with a unique set of parameters. These are fed instantaneously to the instrument up to 120 times per second. The system can be used to modulate instrument parameters by voice, while leaving the note playing to hand-based interfaces.
So here we're only hearing the synthesized sound. It's interesting also to listen to some examples where we get the original voice as well. So I find that interesting, not because it demonstrates both how the system is successful, but also perhaps in terms of sort of performance and musicianly understanding. Sometimes it makes mappings I don't understand. So he sings a single vowel, and at the end of the vowel, a very slight change in his timbral production of that vowel creates a very large change in the synthesis result. So I'll just run back over that again, just so we can see that. Or sometimes it's the amount of change that doesn't seem to map exactly. So again, that's not to criticize it. I mean, this is a very complicated technology, and in a way the aim is kind of magic science. Some of the pictures give us that. It's like I put in my vocal sounds, I press the magic button, and now I can control the synthesizer with my voice. That's a really ambitious project, and I think he's been really successful in getting that up and running. But in terms of what we might want as an ideal performance instrument, it might fall short of our kind of musicianly desires if we want it to behave in the same way that a piano or a guitar or a drum kit behaves, where we can get a really fine level of control and predictability between the input that we put in and the output that we get. So the other example is this mapping of timbral spaces on a synthesizer. So I've very quickly outlined that. We might zoom through some of this video.
Analysis step, the minimum value and the maximum value. So
you have to define the way you want to analyze the sound in terms of what's the range of each parameter and how many steps do we make through it. And it's very simple combinatorics. If I've got 6 parameters and I measure them at 10 stages, that's 10 to the power of 6. So you see the numbers go big very fast. So we're not necessarily measuring all the parameters in detail, although you can, I suppose, do that as well by limiting the ranges of those parameters. And the result will be to take, in this case he's doing it with a VST, so I think he runs it with massive at some point, there we go.
The parameter variation different synthesis states on the VST.
Runs through different states.
Here there is a visualization of the descriptor, and I'm not going to run it.
For each state it analyzes a set of descriptors, and then it does a kind of another magic mapping onto different kinds of parameter spaces. So I'm looking for an example where we see him then play that.
The timbre space based mapping that I can once again load and activate and play around with it using this 2D pad that I have embedded into the patch. So here you can see a visual representation of the timbre space, and then navigating this 2-dimensional space, generating different synthesis combinations. So here is a better example of timbre space interaction. In this case, I've analyzed more than 5,000 synthesis states, and the analysis took quite some time, as well as the computation of the timbre mapping that take a couple of minutes. So here you can see that navigating or moving into this 2-dimensional timbre space and generating different synthesis parameter that as expected, changing the timbre generated by the synthesizer. Here actually the control is not that smooth because
so we're going to get into some technical details here, but again we see these similar kind of visualizations of points in space for each sample. We see exactly the kind of key application of dimensionality reduction here, which is I've got 6 dimensions in, but I want to map them to just 2 and have some kind of control over that. And we see that as he moves through that 2-dimensional space, we sort of jump all over the map in terms of the other parameters. So the mapping that's created is complex, but also automatically taken care of. And I think both of these tools, or certainly this tool that I've shown, is available as a kind of Max for Live device. So if you've got a bunch of synths and you want to do that kind of thing, that's another option. Yeah?
Those samples need to all be discrete? So
no, they're not. No. So what happens?
Still kind of sweeps.
It sweeps through them and it just takes the values. It's not actually recording the samples at all. And then when you do the kind of resynthesis, you're directly controlling the synth. So it's a little bit different from the audio mosaicing. We're just analysing, and I think again Pierre's done some similar kind of work using different technology to try and again map the space of a complex synth. This is some interesting parameters. I'm not gonna go into the paper. I'll just describe it. So Thomas Grill and some other people decided to map ideas of texture, and they decided to ask people what are the key polarities of texture, and they got things like light, dark, light and dark, ordered and unordered, pitched and noisy. And they did a kind of statistical process of getting those terms. So those terms came from the sort of things like an elicitation test where you work through discussion. They narrowed that down and grouped them using kind of language analysis. They developed a set of tools that take in a whole sound, so a whole length of time, and assign a number to it. And then they revalidated those parameters based on listening tests. So they got people to listen and score manually, and then they did a statistical analysis to show that those descriptors matched well to what people were hearing. So I find this project really interesting because I think it's based in perception and it's based in kind of musical ways of listening. So here they've developed actually a kind of visualization. So where patches of colour and pattern are the same, we expect to find similar kinds of sounds. So clearly some kind of pitch is an important parameter here. Much more noisy and time variant, so less static. Pitched, but with more time variation. So even without reading how the map works, I can hear characteristics of these sounds that lead me to believe that I have an understanding of what they might be. So the darkness of the colour seems to be some brightness, darkness thing. So we end up with a bunch of different textual descriptors that we can combine together to characterise sound. And this is, again, an interesting thing where they're taking into account the behaviour over time in some of those descriptors. So interesting work there. So about 8 or 9 years ago, something like that, I got interested in this area, and I built, I guess, two kind of key areas of object. One, which is a kind of Euclidean matcher of sorts, and one or two of which are based on calculating descriptors. And at some point soon, as part of the Flucoma project, or in relation to that, I will probably revise those objects and sort out all kinds of technical problems, but also start to try and address some of these musical problems. And I think also some of the concerns that I'll share at the end are questions that myself and the research fellow, visiting research fellow Sam Pluter are thinking about tackling in some kind of text-based way, and gathering some examples of usage from composers and discussing the problems that people face and discussing things that make musical sense and don't make musical sense. So I suppose I'm returning to this. I'll be presenting right now, I guess, just how I was using it in sort of 2009, 2010, and then we'll go on to talk about a little bit about what I learned and some issues that arise. So I'm not going to present those objects in detail. They're up on my website in the currently public form if people are interested in checking them out. There are some descriptors that don't give the correct results, and if you're interested in knowing which ones are which, send me an email or something. But I don't think any of those affect the piece that these kind of mostly went into. So at this point, I was working on a piece for clarinet and max, which ended up being Fluence. And the idea here was to work with entirely dry clarinet samples and make on-the-fly control curves to actually determine which sample that I would play. So it's a kind of tape music where there's no fixed part. So there's a kind of score about which samples should get played, and everything gets played back from just the recordings. So I took the recordings, I edited them by hand, and then everything happens in real time. And I always do my matching in physical quantities. I never normalize it. And I think that's important in terms of approaching the piece. So we'll look at a couple of things. It's probably instructive for us to have some idea about what the samples are like and how many there are. I think there's about 1,600 that went into the final version. And it might be something quite long, like that. Or it might be something like that. I divide them into noise-based sounds, pitch-based sounds, and transients. So the transients are I've got all kinds of micro edits as well. Super exciting stuff. Hours of endless listening fun. And then in the pitch section I have, as well as various just very boring single pitches, I've got all kinds of multiphonics. Recorded in both stable and unstable ways. So some of that's key-based inflection, some of it is embouchure-based inflection of some kind. So that's the basic kind of material, and I'm going to just demo a very simple form because I think it's going to be more meaningful for us to look at it in a really cut-down manner, and then maybe we'll kind of see how that turns into some music. And maybe look at some of the scory bass patch. What I have here is a system of creating gestures. I've just got some transient type samples loaded up right now. And what I have is the ability to create some kind of gesture with a relatively similar shape and a specified amount of time, but each time it comes out a little bit different. So I'm now generating it over a longer period of time. And we start to see some of the internal kind of inflection in it. Let's do a long one. There we go. So this is an object I wrote that sort of allowed me to create these kind of hypothetical gestures. And we can hear that, for instance, applied to some filtered noise. So it has a similar quality of shape to it, and you can actually play with the amount of variation. This is just a simple example. And down here, I have a kind of ability to match sounds, and I'm just showing here the criteria with which I'm matching. So I'm saying, give me a sound that's in the transient-based group, so that's a hand label, with a duration of less than 300 milliseconds, with a spectral flatness of greater than 0.01, so we could translate that as kind of more noisy sounds. We'll talk later about whether that's really meaningful. And then a centroid that is within 1.3 times or 1.3 divided by whatever the number coming in from this gesture is. So essentially, I can change the spectral centroid of the sample that I'm going to pick to play back, and then use my database to match the nearest 8 samples. It looks like I probably then just randomize between them. I don't remember exactly. So we'll switch from using filtered noise, which sounded like this, to samples. So we hear at least the general trend of that. We also start to hear perhaps some of the issues of having a sparse data set. So we hear some samples being repeated, and we hear some sort of gaps where we can't really seem to get a very good match. I don't think this is an example of an actual gesture in the piece, and I would have dealt with that in terms of how I went about composing the piece. So I guess what happens is then we have a series of cues in the piece, and each one of these cues sets off some kind of gesture, a bit like this, or some kind of mechanism of matching samples. Each one of those is put together by hand, which makes the patch horrific. I never really want to look at the score part again if I can get away with it. But then each time you realise each of these musical gestures, they vary. And a couple of them take some kind of real-time input from the clarinet, but not very many, actually. Most of them are more like a score that the computer is looking at and it's realising it its way. So the resulting patch So I know, for instance, that every time Q5 comes, it's going to be some kind of set of sort of rapidly descending breath sounds. I use pitch information to get the harmonies that I want, so rather than specifying, I think there's no point in terms of playback where I ever say play this file in the piece. I just say this is what you can choose from, and everything is put together in that way. So let's just go through those cues again. So I always know that's going to be that chord. I don't know what order those notes are going to come in. That's not kind of important in the composing of the piece. And just to give some context to that, we can listen to that introduction. So again, I know that attack point is always going to be a kind of rapid flurry of relatively low-pitched key clicks. But I don't know exactly how that's going to play out in any particular performance exactly. Okay, so that's a kind of overview of, I think, what people are doing. We've looked at kind of what things are. But I want to kind of push this on and think a little bit about some specific issues for musicality, some of which are stupid dumb, some of which are a bit more complicated, and some of which I wasn't really aware of when I was working on this kind of technology 10 years ago, and they've become quite apparent to me. So, first problem is, how well does some kind of descriptor translate into perception? Can we interpret what it means? I think across the sort of set of descriptors that is commonly on offer in any library, the answer varies from yes, it's very obvious, to I have no idea what that number means at all and why it's changing. If I listen and see the number change, I don't necessarily see a correspondence or understand that correspondence in an intuitive manner. There's sometimes an issue about the way that descriptors are talked about in the music information retrieval community, and people will say, oh, this descriptor does this. I would say sometimes those commonly held understandings of how to interpret a descriptor are wrong, and I'll show an example of that in a minute. I think the noise and error requirements are different in different situations. So if I've got thousands and thousands of points and I want to cluster things near to one another that are like one another, I can probably suffer a lot more error in terms of how it maps than if I've got a player and the player is, changing their sound somehow, and then the computer is supposed to respond in a very fine-grained way to that. Sam Pluter has a piece for 2 trombones where he solved this problem by having the trombonists have silent mutes in, so the audience don't really hear what they play at all. Being a Sam Pluter piece, I imagine it's quite loud. And so he's not that bothered about whether it translates in an exact manner. He's interested in whether it translates gestures. So if they kind of play a certain kind of gesture, do you get that kind of gesture out, a bit like we saw with the voice mapping to instruments. But again, that's a musical decision he's made, that's acceptable level of reliability, and there might be other situations in which that wouldn't work. More is just more. So having more descriptors doesn't mean we know any more about a sound. Again, if you're doing it in some context where you've got a massive database of sounds and then you've got a dimensionality reduction, it doesn't matter if you have redundancy. It doesn't matter if you've got 2 descriptors telling you basically the same thing. It doesn't matter if you've got a descriptor that really doesn't vary or that's basically just noise. That will get pulled out by the system, but if we're using it in a musical context, that might actually create some kind of barrier to us understanding what's going on. And finally, timing is crucial, and I mean that both in a general musical sense, but also in terms of how we listen. And so there are a number of ways this plays out. Number one is that we're really good at interpreting complex time series in a meaningful way. So deciding, we don't really listen in an average type manner, we listen for certain characteristics, and they're built from a complex understanding of something that's going on. I'm going to show a really stupid example of that someone sent me that took me quite a while to figure out. We're also really good at what we're interested in at a certain point in time. So Rodrigo sent me, we sat together and we tried to figure out how we could analyze what was going on after specific onset. So he's a drummer. He wants to know, I've hit the drum and it makes a certain kind of sound. I want to grab something about that particular hit point. And the timing of that turned out to be really crucial because if you measure too early, you basically get some random noise from what was happening before you actually hit the drum. If you measure in an inconsistent way even, you see the values change and they're not that reliable. And so again, there's a question there about how we can deal with time in a meaningful manner. And I think some of the things that Pierre is complaining to me about right now are down to what are called edge effects. So because we're sometimes slicing time into chunks, we can have a situation where we don't have a full chunk at the end of our analysis. And the way that you solve that, as far as I can figure out, needs to depend on what the descriptor is you're calculating, and there are various different strategies for that, and making sure that you take account of all the samples in terms of individual values that someone's put in a meaningful way is actually a little bit complicated. So again, there's some work to do really on a technical basis just to make sure that something meaningful comes out. So let's look at a few real-world examples and see what we think about the results. Here is the fabled spectral flatness measure and another measure that what I just made up. And I haven't really had time to kind of work through, and I don't know that this is going to be how it works totally. So this is using my sort of FrameLib library, and on the right-hand side we see that we have a flatness measure, not a spectral flatness measure, but a flatness measure. It measures the flatness of a vector of values, which might be anything. But I'm driving it with the amplitude spectrum of an FFT analysis. That's what the bit at the top is. You can just group that and think, oh, that gives us an amplitude spectrum. And on the right, I'm doing a flatness analysis of that. On the left, I'm doing something silly with median filters. Why is this important? In the literature, you will often see people say, oh, spectral flatness tells you how noisy a sample is, or a sound is, or it's something that I have read. So let's put some noise in and see whether or not this is true. And I was hoping to have a little, oh, there we go. Perfect. And we see that we get, on the right-hand side, about minus 1.5. And on the left-hand side, about 0. So we're measuring in decibels. On the right-hand side, we have minus 120. On the left-hand side, we have about minus 81. So far, so good. We've got two measures that can tell the difference between a sine wave and some noise. So we're all good, it must work. The noise is really flat, and the sine wave is not very flat. Brilliant. So that's not very noisy. Let's make it a little bit more complicated, and let's make some pink noise. Now, on the left-hand side, I'm still around about 0. On the right-hand side, I've dropped by about 1.5 decibels to minus 3 dB. So it's telling me, well, what is it telling me? It's less flat. It's pink noise. It is less flat. It is less like a straight line. But is it less noisy? Perceptually, I would say no. Let's make it even harder. And let's put a filter in. Bandpass filter. Minus 12. Is it less noisy? I don't think so. I think it has a similar level of noise if we're wanting to separate out noise from other characteristics. Let's try something else. And let's make a prediction. Oh wait, how did I do? That's what we should check. Oh, minus 6, so even I'm a little bit, oh no, minus 0, minus 1. I can't really read, that's good. That's a bit of a problem, we'll deal with that later. A sawtooth wave. What do we think about a sawtooth wave? Is it noisy? Has it got any noise in it? No. Let's see what our spectral flatness measure will say. Minus 36. That's quite a lot different from our sine wave, because I put a bunch of sine waves together. And again, I'm not getting at anyone who designed this measure. I'm getting at the idea that someone went, the flatter the spectrum, the more noisy it is. And I'm saying, well, actually, the flatter the spectrum, the flatter the spectrum. So the spectral flatness measure, it turns out, does exactly what it says on the tin, and it tells us exactly how flat the spectrum is. And sometimes that can be a very rough correspondence with noise, but there will be situations where it does not give us that. And the reason that I'm working on this measure on the left-hand side, which hopefully, at least in these stupid examples, works a lot better, is because I would like a player to be playing and modifying the amount of noise to sine waves in their sound, and I'd like the computer to do something meaningful in response to that. And I don't think this thing on the right is going to cut it in terms of them really feeling like they're in control. I don't actually yet think that this is perfect either, and we could talk about lots of other things like FFT sizes, and we could also talk about what happens if we go into various other representations. But this is based on a model of seeing how locally flat the spectrum is, I suppose, just to very quickly summarize what I'm doing, which I think is a much better model of whether something is sinusoidal or noisy, or sinusoidal or transient based. If it's locally flat, then we think that it's probably noise-like or transient-like, and if it's locally peaky, we think that it's probably a sine wave. So this is one example of an attempt that I'm making to make descriptors do the actual thing I want to do, and not just pick up the thing that it says in a paper that I should do in that scenario in order to get a better result. Who knows whether I will achieve that in the end? That's a much more complex problem, and I've only shown you the sort of really simple results that make it look like I've done a good job. Why not? Number 2, how loud is a sound? That's a good question, isn't it? How loud is a sound? Let's do some listening. Let's maybe make it a bit louder. How do I make it all? I need to make it all louder. So the problem, I did my volume based on all this pop music, not this dynamic classical recordings. Who thinks that sound 1 is louder than sound 2? That's funny. Let's try it again. Anybody think that sound 1 is louder than sound 2? Anybody think that sound 2 is louder than sound 1? Okay, right, we've got a good consensus here. So this, what happened to me is that Hans Tuchka sent me this question, and he said, I've used your object, and That's what I get out of it. And if we look at those measures, the ones on the left are either about the same or higher than the ones on the right. So Pierre says, oh, Alex, you've done your job wrong. You haven't coded it right. Sorry?
Exactly.
No. No. I have done my job right. There's no problem with any of those measures. Let's look at these samples and let's see where the confusion is coming from. That's the quiet one. That's the loud one. Now, the obvious culprit is all this silence at the end. Maybe that's changing my average. I actually have an energy threshold measure in the object. You can set what's counted as a frame. It does make things a little bit different, but it doesn't make them that much different. Can anyone else see anything else that's going on in these sounds? So this one has quite a varying envelope. Actually, look at this bit here, the diminuendo in relation to the length of the sound. It's actually quite long and quite consistent. Look at the other sound. It's quite consistent in level. So if I take an average of those levels, that's what I get. I don't get a measure of what I hear is louder, but there's no disagreement in the room about which one is louder. Let's go back to my max patch and say, okay, well, how about I make it easier for the computer? And instead of taking the average, I take the max. And now the computer gives me 8 decibels of difference, which is much more in line with what I'm hearing in terms of perception. That's a stupid, dumb example, but wouldn't you just expect that if you analyze the loudness of 2 simple sounds, the computer would tell you which one is louder? It's because of the diminuendo. So we hear the attack, and our brain goes, the beginning bit's the bit that tells me how loud it is, that's how loud it is. And the computer goes, well, I've looked over this period of time, and on average, this is how loud it is. It's not doing anything except what I've asked it to do. I'm not criticizing the technology. What I'm criticizing is our ability to think that what we're doing is really simple when we listen. And so I would propose that if I wanted an attack-based loudness, or I might create a descriptor that looks, and for short sounds, it might take the max over the average. Or I might pick, several loud points in a song. So I might develop a descriptor that has to look over time in a more interesting way, and we're not just taking frame-by-frame descriptors in order to get something that's actually going to mean something. And obviously this is an example where Hans wanted to use it in a piece, and it wasn't going to do the job of substituting for his listening for him. So that was a nice example, which I had forgotten about, because it was about 2 years ago until the other day. So this was an interesting one for me. I assumed that I might get much more redundancy than I did. Actually, I've got the peak amplitude, the RMS amplitude, and the linear centroid. Now, these are 2 amplitude measures, so we might expect them to be similar, but I would actually expect there to be more differentiation than I'm automatically getting. Basically, if I've got this going on, okay, there might be some fine detail that's different, but I'm not really going to get substantially different things from that data, so just adding in another descriptor isn't really giving me that much information. The centroid is really much more peaky. We're really seeing the beginning of the attack. And although the loudness stays, we're seeing how the brightness of each attack dies away quite quickly. So that, although in some ways it's giving us the same overall shape, if I wanted to detect something to do with real attack points, that might actually be a better descriptor to use. But in general, it's worth thinking about how many different ways can I listen to this sound, and perhaps we don't have this kind of infinite array of listening to every different or certain specific sound. So here, my primary listening is probably rhythmic, and then sort of frequency-based. And again, whether or not the centroid is a very good indicator of that is another problem if we try to. So it might be interesting to think about whether the centroid, which is often sort of seen as a substitute for pitch in cases where pitch is not present, because we always get a centroid. Okay, we can definitely hear a differentiation between the high and the low tom, or see the differentiation between the high and the low tom. And again, if we wanted to get into then tying that to onsets, you can see that I've actually got quite a short window of time to get the right value. And if I pick the value either side of the peak, I'm going to get something totally meaningless in terms of actually how that pitch contour or kind of frequency-based contour that I'm hearing is working. So yes, I'm not going to go through that as an example, I think, because I want to have space for questions. But when I sat down with Rod in the summer and did that, and we quantized that, quite often we were not seeing a consistent shape between two repeats of the same pattern. So if you've got slot between the scheduler and the audio threading max, that was creating problems. And there was also a problem to do with the fact that you really need to analyze the bit of time after the attack. So you actually have to wait. You can't know about the attack right now. We might think that we can because our brain kind of puts that, we imagine that we're hearing in real time, but it's actually working at a bit of a lag that we compensate for. And so similarly, the computer can't know right on the attack when imagine it, the beater hits the drum, the skin's not vibrating in a kind of regular manner yet. In fact, it's probably stopped doing nothing. So at that point, we can't know what the frequency of the drum is going to be or the pitch of the drum or whatever. We have to wait a certain amount of time. And getting that window right and making sure also that your attack detection is accurate is actually quite a complicated task for that kind of real-time application. And I suppose the other part of this is that at the moment where we are in the community is having to build these things ourselves and also a sort of the detail of what we want, and there's also a kind of interplay between black boxes where you stick something in and you get a result and you have no ability to really get into the guts of that, and then situations a bit more like this where people might say, well, you've made a couple of objects, but how do I plug them together to do something musically meaningful?